Blood pulled on the hardwood, warm against my cheek, the copper tang filling my mouth. My shoulder hung useless, every breath sharp enough to cut. In the doorway stood my sister Claire, arms folded, eyes unreadable, while Mason's heavy boots retreated down the hall. She didn't kneel beside me. She didn't call for help. She just said it in a voice so calm it sounded rehearsed. "You should have signed the papers, Emily." And then she was gone. "I'm Captain Emily Carter, U.S. Army Medical Corps, 34 years old. I've patched up soldiers in field hospitals under rocket fire. I've studied my hands over torn arteries while helicopters thudded overhead. I've seen men bleed out in desert dust and still kept my voice even. But nothing in my career prepared me for my own sister watching me get beaten in my own home, her words slicing deeper than Mason's fists ever could. That night had been quiet. Too quiet until the pounding started. Not the polite knock of a family visit, but the furious pounding of someone who believed they had the right to break their way in. When the door frame splintered, Mason's face was the first thing I saw, red with rage sweat darkening the collar of his shirt. The second thing I saw was Claire half a step behind him, not looking at me, but scanning the apartment like she was already erasing herself from the scene. I knew why they were there. The week before, they'd brought over a glossy brochure for a 100-acre horse ranch outside Austin. "It's our dream," Claire had said. The way kids talk about running away to join the circus. All they needed, they claimed, was my signature on the loan as a guarantor. It was a $1.2 million mortgage, more than twice my annual base pay. And I'd said no. Not angrily, not dismissively, just no. Because I knew what would happen if their big plans collapsed. And I couldn't be the one to lose my home, my career, my security clearance over someone else's gamble. Mason didn't see it that way. In his mind, I was a traitor to family, to loyalty, to some unwritten code that demanded I sacrifice everything for them. His hands were on me before I could step back, shoving me into the wall hard enough to rattle the framed flag above my desk. My training told me to stay calm, assess injuries, find an exit. My instincts told me to fight. But when my eyes found Claire's, searching for the sister I'd grown up sharing hand-me-downs and secrets with, all I saw was a stranger. Her sentence still hangs in the air for me even now. "You should have signed the papers." As if a line of ink could have erased what was happening in that moment. As if my refusal was the crime and the bruises blooming across my skin were just the inevitable punishment. I'd seen betrayal in combat zones before. Quiet, efficient, and final. I never thought I'd see it in my own living room, delivered by the one person I thought would always cover my six. I wish I could say that night came out of nowhere, that the violence was some random storm I never saw forming. But the truth is, I'd been watching the clouds gather for years, quietly at first, like the way a room changes when the air gets too heavy before a thunderclap. Claire and I grew up in a house where uniforms hung like second skins, and the smell of boot polish lingered in the hallway. Our father was Army, our mother a nurse who'd followed him from base to base. We learned early that discipline and loyalty weren't suggestions. They were orders. I wore those values like armor. Claire. She wore them like a borrowed coat, something she could shrug off when it felt too tight. By the time I shipped out to my first deployment, Claire had dropped out of college. She said it was temporary, just until she figured out what she really wanted. What followed were years of short-lived jobs, bartending, selling cars, running a boutique for a few months before it folded. I sent postcards from the Middle East. She sent photos from music festivals. We were different, but we were still sisters. At least I thought so. Then Mason arrived. He was a former Marine, discharged early after a knee injury. All easy smiles and polished charm the first time we met at a barbecue. But underneath I saw something else. The way his hand lingered too tightly on Claire's arm when she laughed, the subtle corrections when she spoke like he was editing her in real time. I'd been around enough soldiers to recognize control when I saw it. It rarely starts with shouting. It starts with shaping. Still a year later, I stood beside Claire as her maid of honor at a wedding in Austin that looked like a magazine spread. A live band, crystal centerpieces, the kind of champagne you don't buy on a budget. I smiled for photos, but inside I couldn't stop thinking about the bills. Mason's landscaping business was just breaking even. Claire wasn't working. I knew they didn't have the savings for this. It wasn't long before the calls started first for small amounts, then bigger. Just until the next contract comes through, Mason would say. I told myself it was family, that this was what you did. But every time I said yes, I felt a little piece of that armor I'd carried since Fort Bragg start to crack. I didn't know it yet, but those cracks were how the storm would find its way in. It was a Tuesday night when they showed up Claire in a silk dress I'd never seen before. Mason in a tailored suit that didn't fit the man who usually lived in work boots. They brought a bottle of wine so expensive it deserved its own security detail, the kind you don't open unless you're making a point. They settled in like it was a social call, but Mason's eyes kept scanning my apartment, pausing on the medals in the shadow box above my desk. Claire's smile was too bright, her laugh half a second too quick. Then Mason reached into his leather briefcase and slid a glossy brochure across my coffee table. 100 acres in Texas. Rolling pastures, a white fenced arena, a barn that looked like it had been lifted from a movie set. This, Claire said, tapping the page with a manicured finger, is our future. Mason leaned in his tone, low and deliberate. All we need is your signature on the loan. With your record, the bank will approve it instantly. We're talking life-changing, Emily. I didn't even have to read the fine print to know it was trouble. A $1.20, $2 million mortgage. No steady income between them, and the kind of optimism that burns through money faster than fire through dry grass. I told them I'd think about it, which bought me exactly 24 hours before Mason started texting reminders. The next morning, I walked into Lieutenant Colonel Miller's office on base. He'd been my mentor since my first deployment, a man who could read a balance sheet as easily as a battlefield map. He skimmed the brochure, his jaw tightening. "Absolutely not," he said. "You sign this, and you're tying your career and your security clearance to their financial disaster waiting to happen. Don't let family push you into a hole you can't climb out of." When I told Claire and Mason my answer that weekend, the air in my living room changed. Claire's smile faltered. Mason's did not. It sharpened, like he just marked me on a list I couldn't see. He said nothing overt, just placed his glass down slowly, the base ringing against the wood. But the way he looked at me, steady measuring, felt like a promise. Not the kind you keep, the kind you collect. Mason didn't waste time pretending my no was the end of it. The messages started that night. Long, ranting texts about loyalty, about what family owes each other. He'd remind me of favors I never asked for, debts that existed only in his telling of the story. Between them came the calls, silent at first, then heavy with breathing, then his voice low and controlled. "You're making a mistake you can't undo, Captain." Claire's approach was softer, but no less cutting. She sent old photos. 2 girls in Fort Bragg wearing mismatched fatigues, grinning like the world couldn't touch us. Attached would be a line, "Guess we're not teammates anymore." Another time, a snapshot of us at my officer commissioning ceremony. Her arm looped through mine with, "I was there for you. You can't do this for me." I'd stare at the screen, my thumb hovering over the keyboard, but I never sent the words I wanted to about choice and boundaries, and the difference between love and leverage. A week later, Mason crossed a line. I was on shift at the base medical facility, finishing a post-op chart, when I heard raised voices in the corridor. 2 MPs had him cornered near the check-in desk. He was holding the same brochure, waving it like proof of my betrayal. His voice carried, "She's family. She can't hide behind a uniform to ignore that." I didn't go out there. I just called the duty officer and let procedure handle it. Still, the stares from my colleagues followed me for days afterwards. Then came the truck. A black pickup, the kind Mason drove, started parking half a block from my apartment. Some nights it idled there with the lights off. Other times it just sat engine cold, like a marker left on my street. I'd come home from late shifts and feel that prickle between my shoulder blades, the one I'd learned to trust in war zones. I began keeping a log screenshots, call records, photos of the truck with timestamps. I printed copies and handed them to Sergeant First Class Rodriguez, our base security NCO. He didn't flinch, just said, "We'll keep eyes out. And Captain, don't be alone when you don't have to." It was sound advice. But even with the army watching my six, I could feel the circle tightening. Mason wasn't going to disappear. He was waiting for the moment he thought I'd break. It was just past 9 when my phone lit up with Claire's name. I almost let it ring out, but something in my gut told me to answer. Her voice was wrong, too calm, almost rehearsed. "Mason's upset. He wants to talk to you. No details, no apology, just a statement like she was reading a weather report." Before I could respond, she hung up. 15 minutes later, the pounding started. Not a knock, a full, flat palmed assault on my door that made the hinges groan. Mason's voice tore through the wood, thick with fury. "Open the damn door, Emily." I backed toward the kitchen phone in hand, thumb over the number for the MPs. But I hesitated. Part of me still believed that if I called them now, there'd be no going back. Not with Claire. That moment of pause cost me everything. The frame splintered under his shoulder, the door swinging wide. He was on me before I could step back. The smell of whiskey sharp in the air. The first hit came fast, an open-handed shove that sent my head snapping to the side. Then a fist to my cheek and another to my shoulder, driving me back into the wall so hard a picture frame rattled to the floor. Pain flared white in my vision. And there she was, Claire, standing in the doorway, arms crossed her weight on one hip, like this was just an inconvenience in her night. Her voice was steady, almost bored. "You should have signed the papers." I wanted to ask her how we got here. From braiding each other's hair in the back of Dad's Jeep to watching me bleed in my own living room. But Mason wasn't finished. He swept his arm across the coffee table, sending my laptop crashing to the floor, then leaned in close enough that I could see the burst blood vessels in his eyes. Next time he hissed, "You'll think twice." Then he was gone. Claire with him. The door frame hung jagged, the air thick with the smell of sweat and broken wood. I pressed my hand to my cheek and felt the swelling start under my skin. It took me nearly 10 minutes to get to the gate at the edge of the base, every step sending a jolt through my shoulder. The MPs didn't ask questions they didn't have to. I was in uniform bleeding, and I had a name. And for the first time in this whole mess, it wasn't mine they'd be writing down. The MPs drove me straight to the base hospital. Fluorescent lights, antiseptic air, the cold press of a nurse's hands on my cheek. X-rays confirmed a fractured zygomatic bone, deep bruising along my shoulder. I'd seen worse in combat zones, but those wounds had never come from my own bloodline. By morning, C had taken over. Special Agent Harris introduced himself in a voice that didn't waste words. "We're treating this as both a federal assault case and a potential military jurisdiction matter," he said, flipping open a notepad. His questions were precise, and I answered each one with the same clipped clarity I'd used in field reports. But it was the way he listened. Like every pause meant something that told me he'd been doing this a long time. 2 days later, Claire called. No apology, no acknowledgement of the bruises she'd seen with her own eyes. "Just Emily dropped the charges. You're making this worse for the family. People talk. Dad doesn't need the shame." I didn't raise my voice, but I didn't bend either. I'm not the one who brought shame into this family. With my JAG attorney, Captain Reeves, we built the case piece by piece. Hallway security footage showing Mason forcing my door, the string of threatening texts, and then the Jem Harris found an old police report from Oklahoma where Mason had been accused of assaulting a former girlfriend. The charges had been dropped back then, not this time. The trial split in 2 tracks, federal court for the assault, and a military review board for conduct on a federal installation. Mason came in wearing a pressed suit, hair neatly trimmed, his medals pinned to his lapel. He played the part, well soft-spoken eyes cast down the wounded veteran who let his temper get the better of him. I'd braced myself for the worst that Claire would hold to her story, keep his hands clean in the eyes of the jury. But on the 3rd day, something shifted. She took the stand voice, trembling at first, then stronger. She described the pounding on my door the moment it gave way. The first blow Mason threw. Every word she spoke drove the air out of the room. When she finished, there was no mistaking it. The jury was looking at me differently. not as a sister fueling a feud, but as someone who had survived exactly what I'd said I had. And Mason, for the first time since this began, he stopped smiling. Mason's sentence came down on a rainy Thursday afternoon. 6 years in federal prison, followed by a lifetime restraining order. The judge's voice was steady, but final like a gavel hitting stone. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. The weight I'd carried for months wasn't gone, but it had shifted enough for me to stand a little straighter. The physical healing was measured in x-rays and range of motion charts. The rest, the sleepless nights, the jolts of panic at sudden noises, took longer. The Army assigned me a counselor specializing in combat trauma, but it was the Warrior Sisters group that studied me. Women in uniform, each with her own story of betrayal behind closed doors. We didn't need to explain the intersection of service and survival we already knew. Claire's divorce filing came quietly without fanfare. She left me a voicemail one morning. I'm out. Weeks later, she asked if I'd meet her for coffee. The conversation was halting at first, full of unspoken landmines, but it was a start. She was in therapy now, learning to unpick the years Mason had woven into her. I wasn't ready to forgive, not fully, but I could see the sister I remembered trying to surface again. I requested a transfer away from my old quarters and into a training role, teaching combat medics how to keep their heads in chaos. The classroom was cleaner than the field, but I kept the scenarios gritty real. I told them that boundaries weren't just about patient care. They were survival. Whether you were in a war zone or your own living room some nights, I'd walk the perimeter of the training grounds after the last cadet left the Texas wind carrying the faint smell of dust and diesel. I'd think about the invisible lines we all draw and how easily they can be crossed when we're taught that family excuses anything. The Army had taught me discipline. Mason had taught me the cost of letting someone else define your loyalty. And somewhere between those lessons, I learned that my life, my safety, wasn't negotiable. Not for blood, not for history, not for anyone. The first time I stood at a podium after everything, the room was filled with uniforms, some pressed and decorated, others faded from years of service. It was a conference on domestic violence and financial exploitation in the military community, and my name was printed neatly on the program beneath the words guest speaker. I told my story without softening the edges, not to sensationalize, but because the truth didn't need embellishment. I spoke about how easily loyalty can be weaponized, how family ties can become handcuffs if you're not careful. Heads nodded, some eyes dropped to the floor. They understood. A month later, a letter arrived from a federal correctional facility. Mason's handwriting was the same sharp controlled. He wrote that he was sorry, that prison had given him perspective. I read it once, twice, then set it aside. His words didn't sting. They didn't heal. My recovery had never depended on his remorse. Claire came to that same conference the following year. She sat in the back, hands folded in her lap, and listened. We didn't talk much afterward, just a hug, brief but steady. Sometimes reconciliation isn't loud. It's simply the absence of harm. If there's one thing I've carried from all of this, it's that blood doesn't make you safe, and history doesn't make you obligated. In the military, we drill every possible threat scenario. We prepare for the enemy outside the wire. But no one tells you how to armor yourself against someone who knows your childhood nickname, who sat beside you at the dinner table, who calls you family. So I tell them now, draw your boundaries in ink, not pencil. Seek your allies on your base, in your unit in the law. Don't let love or the memory of it talk you into risking your safety or your future. We train to defend a nation, but sometimes the truest battle is defending yourself from the people you thought you'd never have to fight. And when you win that battle, not with rage, but with resolve, you carry a different kind of honor, one no one can take from you. If this story touched you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Where in the world are you watching from? Share your location and your feelings. I read every message. Your voice matters here. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join our growing,